The ancients referred to sight as the most excellent of the sensory perceptions, and down through the entire history of religion and philosophy, the power and faculty of sight has played a very large part in the development of man's concepts of God and nature. Sight is probably the most important bridge that the individual has between his internal life and the material world around him. And from the beginning, sight has had a certain validity, a certain power, which has extended itself to every phase of life and has been accepted as almost absolute testimony before a court of law. Things seen are difficult to deny. That which we have actually beheld with our own eyes, we affirm and insist to be true. And it is difficult to shake us from any conviction which we can support by visual evidence. Yet from the beginning, man has been suspicious of sight. He has not been quite sure how valid the testimony of the eye should really be considered. Of course, in Eastern philosophy, it has not been regarded as especially valid. But at the same time, it has been universally admitted that things seen must have some kind of existence. They must have shape and form and color. They must also have relationships by proximity or distance. They have mass and body to them. Or else we may perceive motion, not of itself, but through things moved. And gradually, through the use of sight, we develop attitudes, and these attitudes become very important in our daily thinking. If it had not been for sight, for example, we might never have become so desperately fascinated with the material world around us. Sight causes us to give precedence to things seen, regarding them as more real or valuable than things unseen. Here, however, we must pause for a moment, for in the last few centuries in particular, we have come to recognize that the power of sight is comparatively limited, that for one thing that can be seen by the eyes, there must be 100 other things which cannot be seen. Sight, because of its very structure, is restricted and limited to a certain vibratory range. Things seen are innumerable, but the power to see them differs very strongly with individuals. One very simple impediment of sight, which to most persons is not regarded with utter seriousness, is color blindness. The colorblind person lives in a world of color distortions, depending largely upon the degree of his color blindness. If he is defective only in the power to see a particular or certain color, he may have a considerable color range of visibility, but the colors will not be exactly as the normal person sees them. He has a restriction. If he is unable to see the color blue, for example, everything in nature that is blue becomes gray or colorless. If red is the color that is not in his visual spectrum, then red in everything ceases to be red. If, however, it was only this, it might not be so confusing. But this same faculty, by its defect, cuts out red from many other compound color combinations. Therefore, violet becomes blue, orange becomes yellow. Wherever the red factor exists, there is no longer a proper or adequate registration. Now, to the person who is born with this defect, his own color world may seem to be rather normal to him. He grows up in it, he is not aware of anything else, and while perhaps intellectually he can be taught to realize that he has a color deficiency, he cannot actually experience it, because experience again is a matter of contrast. If he had once had the power to see red and lost it, then he would be able to estimate his own deficiency. But if he is born without this power, then to him the universe is the color combination which he can see. We use this merely to point out that even within our so-called normal experiences, there are examples in which we note clearly that the eye is not always trustworthy, and that its actual ability to register properly depends upon its own nature and its own structure and its own energy, rather than upon the form or structure of things seen. There is certain dependency, of course, upon the objective, but there is also a great responsibility upon the subjective power of sight. The sight also is very heavily influenced by attention. The things which we want to see, we see clearly, sometimes to an exaggerated degree. But if our minds are indifferent to a thing, we are not aware of it with any clarity of sight. Also, the sight problem becomes easily confused by mentation. A dozen persons observing an accident will bring in 12 different accounts of that accident, each account in some way psychologically influenced by basic attitudes of the person who sees. Thus we know that sight is highly conditioned by attitude, and that things which appear to be perfectly commonplace and about which there seems to be no visual problem become complicated because of attitude, because of our own intention to disregard, or our failure to be attentive, or a preconception about a thing. Even after the visual registry has been achieved with some accuracy, we are able to mentally and emotionally undermine this evidence until actually we are able to talk ourselves or think ourselves or argue ourselves out of that which we have actually seen. If it were not for the fact that we have certain mental blindness, sometimes combined with perfect visual power, that we are able to have so many diverse and often inconsistent attitudes and opinions about common things. Another problem that we do observe very definitely in connection with sight is its aesthetic factor. Persons of apparently normal sight, looking at a certain object, particularly an object which is regarded as a work of art, will come to a number of different attitudes or conclusions about that object. To some, a particular painting is immediately a thing of beauty. To others, it will never appear attractive. To one person, a certain type of sculptural figure will seem to have magnificent proportion. To another person, there will be no such symmetry. It will seem distorted, strange, and unpleasant. All things being taken together, we know that in art especially, familiarity becomes the basis of much acceptance. We can talk ourselves in and out of the values of the things we see aesthetically. If we belong to a time in which classical art is favored, we will find many beauties in it. But if we live in a time of Impressionism, Cubism, or Surrealism, we then demand an entirely different standard. And by our intellectual control of our own emotions, we declare things to be different from what they really are.